August 25, 2022. The Lynn Commons Apartments in Tucson, Arizona. It's a multi-unit complex near East Gulf Links Road. A routine court-ordered eviction is on the schedule. You have an armed county constable on site and a property manager standing by with the keys.
Right, they're just ready to process what is documented on the books as routine turnover paperwork.
Exactly. But what is scheduled as a standard civil lockout transforms, in a matter of seconds, into an unmitigated ambush at the threshold. In this report, Priya uncovers the hidden extreme risks buried in these supposedly routine property management protocols.
And by the end of this briefing, you will understand the fatal operational miscalculation in standard civil turnover procedures. More importantly, you will understand the exact staging mandates required to protect both your frontline personnel and your institutional capital allocations.
Because today we are diving into a stack of exclusive private investigative sources from the Midnight Ledger. Specifically, we're looking at case log Fox-Heath 2022-0825. This was compiled by lead investigator Priyanshu Adathakkar, or Pri.
And our mission for this deep dive is to figure out exactly why standard real estate underwriting is totally blind to severe physical operational risks. I mean, it's a blindness that led to a tragedy in Tucson that cost 3 innocent people their lives.
It is a profound disconnect between the financial modeling of an asset and the physical reality of managing it. We are looking at a systemic failure here.
A failure that institutional owners, private equity, and developers can no longer afford to ignore.
Absolutely. So to understand how that disconnect happens on the ground, let's break down the core mechanics of prize findings inside the ledger.
We have to start by examining the immediate physical environment of the event, because the spatial reality is where this fatal underwriting disconnect actually begins.
Yeah.
You have Angela Fox-Heath. She was 37 years old, the dedicated property manager of Lynn Commons.
Yeah, and on that August morning, she is accompanying Pima County Constable Deborah Martinez-Garibay, who is a decorated U.S. Army veteran.
Right. And their objective on paper is incredibly simple. Serve a civil eviction notice to a tenant, a 35-year-old named Gavin Lee Stansel. Secure the unit and perform the administrative rekeying.
But let's visualize that physical environment for a second. They are approaching the apartment door via an exterior breezeway. For anyone who hasn't walked one of these properties, a breezeway is a completely exposed position.
It really is. It's essentially a narrow corridor open to the air, usually with a railing on one side and a wall of apartment doors on the other.
There is no cover. There's nowhere to hide. And as they reach that threshold, Stansel opens fire with a handgun. No warning, no preceding argument at all. Just a sudden barrage of lethal violence right at the point of entry.
It's chilling. Fox-Heath is killed at the scene. Constable Martinez-Garibay is fatally shot. And a 22-year-old neighbor, Elijah Miranda, who had absolutely zero involvement in the eviction proceedings, is caught in the gunfire and also loses his life.
3 lives completely erased in seconds. And as tactical units eventually converge on the property, Stansel takes his own life inside the apartment, ending the standoff.
As Pri points out in this week's perspective, the commercial real estate industry fundamentally misclassifies these events at the most basic level.
They treat it like a clipboard exercise.
Exactly. Asset managers and underwriters universally code eviction notices as routine civil administrative tasks. No different than checking a fire extinguisher or filing a maintenance ticket.
But the reality of that interaction is completely different on the ground.
Yes. In reality, you are sending civilian staff to enforce physical displacement on an individual who is likely experiencing an acute life-altering crisis. Losing your housing is a traumatic high-stress event.
Right, and yet the industry frequently executes these lockouts without any tactical intelligence whatsoever. I think we need to contrast the training here to really grasp how absurd this expectation is.
That's a vital point.
When you look at standard property management training, it is entirely centered on customer service and de-escalation. The training is essentially smile, knock, and step back. Be polite, hand them the paperwork.
But a threshold eviction with a non-compliant tenant is a tactical scenario. Tactical law enforcement trains for this using concepts like slicing the pie to check corners.
Or avoiding what they call the fatal funnel, which is the doorway itself where you are silhouetted and totally exposed. We are asking property managers trained in hospitality to operate inside a fatal funnel.
That is the exact crux of the issue. You have 2 entirely different realities colliding at that door.
Wait, let me make sure I have this straight because I need to stop and push back here as an investigator. When I read through the raw evidence in the Midnight Ledger logs, this specific incident wasn't just a sudden, unpredictable snap from an otherwise quiet tenant.
No, the post-incident investigations revealed a very different picture.
Right. Stansel had a long documented history of aggressive, volatile behavior. There were previous altercations, there were direct verbal threats aimed at neighbors and at the property personnel themselves.
Threats that acted as the catalyst for the formal eviction action to begin with.
Exactly. So, if there were documented pre-incident markers and explicit verbal threats on file, why on earth was this handled as a standard lockout with unassisted civilian property staff and a single constable?
That is the precise question that exposes the massive liability hidden in the property management system. It was handled that way because the standard operating procedures of conventional property management simply do not have a mechanism to escalate an administrative task into a tactical threat response.
So the system is essentially blind to the context of the eviction.
Completely blind. The software system and the corporate playbook treat a highly volatile tenant with a documented history of threats exactly the same as a tenant who simply lost their job, missed 2 months of rent, and vacated quietly in the middle of the night.
To the front office and to the institutional owner looking at a dashboard, the paperwork looks identical. A scheduled lockout is just a scheduled lockout.
Right. There is no formal threat vetting protocol mandated in the standard institutional playbook. And that operational blindness is what placed a civilian property manager directly in the line of fire in a highly exposed breezeway.
Which brings us to the mathematical reality of that operational blindness. Priya built a diagnostic tool specifically to expose this flaw. He calls it the Eviction Threat Exposure Simulator. It's a civil lockout risk model designed to quantify exactly what happens when you combine these poor operational vectors.
It's a brilliant piece of investigative synthesis, because instead of relying on intuition, the simulator forces you to look at the hard math. The variables in this matrix are chillingly clear, and they interact with each other to compound the risk.
I want to dig into the mechanics of that simulator, because when I was reviewing the case file, the metric that jumped off the page was this 97% risk factor. Wait, 97%. How does the simulator actually weigh those variables to get a number that astronomically high? What is the math behind the curtain?
Well, it comes down to 3 specific inputs and how the simulator applies exponential multipliers to them. The first variable you input is the law enforcement level.
Okay, so in the Tucson case, that was a single civil constable whose primary role is serving papers.
Exactly, rather than a multi-officer, high-risk tactical escort. That establishes a high baseline risk right away because there is no overwhelming physical deterrent present.
Okay, so a low level of tactical presence. What's the second variable?
The second input is the threat vetting history. You input whether the tenant is a verified cooperative vacancy, an unknown entity, or in Stansel's case, a tenant with documented threats and highly volatile behavior.
And I imagine that changes the math significantly.
It applies a massive multiplier, because a known threat alters the entire psychology of the encounter. It is no longer an administrative surprise, it is a premeditated confrontation.
And the third variable?
The third and most critical input is the staff staging protocol.
Oh.
Where is the civilian staff member located at the exact moment the door is breached?
And in Tucson, the protocol was what the industry calls at door with officer, which literally places the civilian staff member, Angela Fox-Heath, directly inside the hot zone, standing right in the fatal funnel.
Exactly. The simulator treats physical proximity as an exponential multiplier. I mean, if you have a known threat and minimal law enforcement, but the civilian is 5 miles away, the civilian's physical risk is 0.
Right, but when you combine all 3 specific parameters in Pri's simulator documented threats, a single civil constable and civilian staff at door, the algorithm factors in the 0 reaction time afforded by the breezeway architecture.
And that is when the calculated SACE exposure index hits that critical 97%.
A 97% probability of extreme threshold vulnerability. So if I'm understanding the math and the physical reality here, keeping standard eviction protocols in place under these conditions is basically like sending an unarmed accountant to clear a tactical hot zone without any military intelligence.
It really is.
You are taking someone whose primary professional skill set is ledger reconciliation, lease negotiation, and community relations, and you are positioning them at the absolute apex of a high-friction, potentially lethal tactical confrontation.
That is the perfect analogy. You are asking an accountant to perform the duties of a SWAT operator just because they happen to be holding the key to the door. Pri's investigation into the ledger shows that treating a lockout as mere paperwork is a systemic failure of leadership and underwriting.
A massive failure.
A failure that not only destroys human life, which is the ultimate tragedy, but from a purely financial perspective, it instantly destabilizes the entire asset.
But here is where his investigation takes a completely unexpected turn.
Because the focus shifts from identifying the failure to entirely restructuring the operational response.
It's easy to see how a 97% risk factor demands a radical change, which leads us to ask what the actual solution looks like on the ground. Moving on to our next major pillar, how Pri systematically navigated these operational hurdles.
The immediate aftermath of the Lynn Commons tragedy forced a massive reckoning. We saw rapid, almost overnight policy shifts across Arizona property management firms. They could no longer ignore the math.
They had to confront the reality of that critical exposure index.
They did. And the structural solution they arrived at, which Pri outlines in detail, is what is now known as the staging mandate.
Let's explain how the staging mandate physically works, because it completely changes the choreography of the eviction. The mandate completely removes the civilian from the hot zone. It requires that property managers, maintenance staff, and any other administrative personnel remain in strictly enforced off-site staging.
Yes. They are not waiting in the parking lot. They're not waiting at the bottom of the stairs. They must hold at the outer perimeter, completely off the immediate property lines.
Until law enforcement has entirely cleared the dwelling, secured all rooms, checked for secondary threats, and formally handed over the property.
Exactly. Only after the police radio and all clear does it become a deferred entry for the civilian staff to go in and change the locks.
It fundamentally reclassifies the eviction. It is no longer viewed as a joint administrative handover. It is executed first as a law enforcement tactical operation and only followed by an administrative securement.
Right. And this brings us to how Price saw what the spreadsheets missed. Let's talk about the underwriting disconnect, because this is where the financial world violently collides with the physical world.
Yeah, when you look at conventional institutional underwriting for distressed assets, whether an investment group is buying a struggling multifamily apartment complex or acquiring a distressed hospitality property, the analysts sitting in an office in New York or Chicago are strictly looking at financial metrics on a screen.
Right. They are laser focused on a few key indicators. They are looking at cap rates. They are analyzing yield compression. They are modeling RevPAR.
Let's slow down for a second and define those, because we see these terms thrown around in institutional underwriting all the time, but we need to connect them directly to the physical danger at the door. Cap rate, or capitalization rate, is essentially the expected rate of return on the property based on the income it generates.
Precisely. And RevPAR, which is heavily used in hospitality and adaptable to multi-unit, stands for revenue per available room.
So the underwriter builds this beautiful spreadsheet. They assume that if they buy a distressed property, they can just evict the non-paying or problematic tenants, renovate the units, raise the rent, and boost the cap rate and the RevPAR.
The math looks flawless on paper.
But they are entirely looking at the projected yield, and they are completely dangerously blind to the execution risk of actually stabilizing that yield. They assume that turning over a distressed property full of volatile tenants is just a matter of filing the right civil paperwork, paying a court fee, and scheduling a locksmith.
And that assumption is exactly where the financial models collapse. Because what happens to your RevPAR when an eviction turns into a legal ambush?
It plummets to zero.
Exactly. When a violent incident occurs, you don't just lose the revenue from that single unit. The entire breezeway becomes a crime scene. Neighboring units become unrentable.
The physical damage to the property has to be remediated. Your insurance premiums skyrocket overnight.
And the property is forced to hire 2047 armed private security, which completely obliterates your operating budget.
Not to mention the profound community trauma. Good. Paying tenants are going to break their leases and move out because they no longer feel safe walking from their car to their apartment.
Yes. The asset experiences mass vacancy. The yield vanishes. The cap rate calculation they presented to their investors is entirely destroyed because they failed to underwrite the physical friction of tenant displacement.
Which brings us to the unique tactical advantage that Pri brings to the table, and why his specific background is so vital to solving this. He operates with a rare dual authority in this space. He is a specialized commercial real estate investment advisor, so he understands the macroeconomic capital allocation strategies, the cap rates, and the yield compression.
But he is also a licensed realtor.
Right.
That dual identity is his superpower here. He possesses the boots on the ground, door-to-door operational intelligence. He doesn't just evaluate the projected financial yield of acquiring a distressed asset from behind a desk. He meticulously audits the physical threat vectors required to actually stabilize it.
Because if an asset requires high-volume tenant turnover to achieve its modeled cap rate, and the underwriter hasn't factored in the physical liabilities, the mandated staging security costs, and the potential community trauma of violent displacement, that financial model isn't an investment. It is essentially built on a powder keg.
And this is a universal truth of the market. It doesn't matter where the asset is physically located.
Exactly. While what PRI is reporting from the ground in central Ohio is typically focused on macro shifts across the wider Midwest, analyzing hyperlocal RevPay trends, complex zoning deadlocks, and industrial expansion, this specific Tucson case file serves as his definitive proof that local operational blind spots can trigger catastrophic losses absolutely anywhere.
The geography changes. You can be in a high-rise in Columbus or a garden-style apartment in Arizona, but the vulnerability of the threshold remains constant.
The friction point of human displacement does not change.
Right. Whether you are acquiring a distressed portfolio in the Midwest or stabilizing a multi-unit complex in the Southwest, if your operational playbook allows unvetted, unassisted civilian staff to execute lockouts on hostile tenants, your capital is highly exposed.
You are inviting severe litigation, massive operational paralysis, and devastating reputational damage to your brand.
So let's establish the definitive bottom line of PRI's report. We've looked at the tragedy, we've broken down the math of the simulator, and we've mapped out the financial fallout.
The tragedy at Lynn Commons proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that civil lockouts are high-friction tactical environments. They are emphatically not administrative errands to be handled with a clipboard and a smile.
The macroeconomic takeaway for any institutional owner, private equity group, or elite developer listening to this briefing right now is absolute. Any underwriting strategy for distressed asset acquisition must now include mandatory off-site staging protocols.
It must include rigorous, documented threat vetting for all tenant turnover prior to scheduling a lockout.
You simply cannot model a successful acquisition without budgeting for the tactical reality of asset stabilization.
Which really summarizes the objective value of this methodology. It shows exactly why combining on-the-ground threat auditing with high-level financial underwriting isn't just a luxury, it's an absolute necessity. Conventional underwriters will hand you a sanitized spreadsheet that completely ignores a 97% critical risk factor because they don't know how to look for it.
PRI delivers the full operational ledger, protecting both the lives of your personnel and the viability of your capital. You have to know what is waiting on the other side of the door before you underwrite the property. Because if you get it wrong, the cost is incalculable.
If standard operating procedure missed the 97% critical risk factor in Tucson, what operational liabilities are currently sitting unrecognized in your own portfolio's ledger?
But the analysis doesn't stop here. If you want to dive deeper into the data before the next bell rings, make sure to hit that subscribe or follow button right now in your favorite podcast app. If you found value in tonight's reporting, leave us a 5-star review. It helps other listeners find their way to the table. For exclusive updates, show notes, and deep dives, visit our website at bearinvestors.com. Until next time, stay sharp and keep your books balanced.